Thank you very much, Price. It's great to be here. I come from the Northeast where we're still digging out snow, so it's wonderful to see the sun and feel the warm weather. Most of my work has been in economic history, but I want to talk about contemporary events. And you might recall, it's just about a year ago that we had Liberation Day, or so-called, early April of last year, when President Trump announced in the Rose Garden a set of tariffs, new tariffs, on a whole bunch of different countries. And this is the placard that sort of announces them. You can see the list of countries and the two columns of tariffs. The first ones were the ones that he wanted to impose, but he cut them in half because he's a generous person. And the right-hand column is the tariffs that would actually go into effect. And the Supreme Court has ruled on this, and I'll come to that at the very end. But I want to take you back to that moment and that year, a year ago, because you might not remember exactly what happened in the markets after this announcement of very high tariffs being imposed on imports across all these countries. For 3 consecutive days, the markets lost about 1%. So cumulatively, it's about 3 to 4% of market value until the president offered a pause, a 90-day pause on the imposition of the tariffs. But then they did take effect later in the year, around early August. But he had already announced previous tariffs on autos, on potentially Canada and Mexico as well. So clearly tariffs are on the agenda. And so, when he said that the tariffs were going to stay, which they didn't, the markets went down even more. And of course, you might think this would rattle the president to have made this major policy announcement and have the markets for 3 consecutive days go down. Well, let's recall what he thinks about the stock market. When he came into office in January of last year, he said, well, the stock market has been going up ever since the election. This is my market. This is my stock market. Of course, when we had this reversal in April, he said, this is Joe Biden's stock market. Because, this is reflecting the past. So there's a little bit of a selective memory here in terms of what the announcements are and what the market's doing. But there's no doubt whatsoever that President Trump is very enamored with tariffs. And the White House has tweeted out this, Mr. Tariff. This is the defining signature element of his policy. And I don't know how many of you have been in the West Wing. It actually does look a little bit like the old TV series. It's not very big. The corridors are very sort of narrow, rabbit holes worn of different offices. But there are a lot of pictures of the president in various state events on the walls, and they rotate these in and out. Apparently this is a picture of the staircase going down to the Situation Room and the White House mess, and you might see something there which would attract the attention of an economic historian. That is, this is what the White House came up with, the tariff man. So here's our historical quiz. Who is the person on the far left?
Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton. Who's the next person? I think it is Henry Clay, but it might be James Madison, I'm not sure. Who's the person next to the president there? Abraham Lincoln, of course. And who's next to him?
McKinley.
William McKinley. These are past figures, not all presidents. Alexander Hamilton was never president, but they all embraced tariffs in one way or another. This is what he says would happen if we didn't have these tariffs. Everyone would be bankrupt. The economy would just be in a shambles. So this is really important for America going forward. Here's more words on tariffs. It's going to be the greatest thing we've ever done. It's going to make our country rich again. Instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, let's tax other countries to enrich our citizens. Tariffs are the way to do so. They were the greatest thing ever invented, and to him, he later retracted this statement, by the way, that the most beautiful word in the language is the word tariff. And he walked that back. He said, love isn't more important, but tariffs are really high up there. A great word. Now the question is, what is a tariff? How many of you know what a tariff is? Okay, probably more than half, but guess what? Only about 45% of Americans know what a tariff is. And given that this is the signature economic policy of the president, one would think we should know a little bit more about tariffs. So here's the simple definition of what a tariff is. It's a tax on imported goods. And so when you think of the word tariff, you have to think of the word tax. Now we don't use that word tax, we use the word tariff, but that's just covering up the fact that It's actually a tax. Now, the administration, of course, wants to cut taxes, not raise them. So a lot of their statements will sort of walk around this issue about whether we're imposing these taxes. So in the first term, his Secretary of the Treasury, Stephen Mnuchin, said, tariffs are a tariff on import, they're not a tax. But of course, it is a tax, but they're just not calling it a tax. President Trump has said it is a tax, but it's a tax on a foreign country. It's not a tax on us. It's a tax that doesn't affect our country, as he said during the campaign rallies. That's debatable, and we'll sort of come up to that issue. One of his aides, Peter Navarro, said, actually, tariffs are a tax cut. So that's really moving the other way, that it's not a tax increase, we're actually cutting taxes in some sense. There is a little bit of logic and context to this, because one of the goals of the administration is to substitute income taxes, or tariffs for income taxes. They're both raising revenue, and the question is, can you adjust one or the other? Now, I have this whole book, as Price generously mentioned, on the history of tariffs, and I don't want to walk through that whole history or show you the time series, but let me just talk about the last couple of decades. Tariffs have traditionally been fairly low in the United States since World War II. So here's the average tariff rate in the rest of the world. Here's the average tariff rate in the United States. We're talking about, in the past 2 or 3 decades, we're talking about 2% or so is the average tax on imported goods. But these new tariffs that were announced in April, Liberation Day tariffs, were really quite dramatic. Some of them were quite high, over 40 or 50% on certain countries. Even countries that we had good trade relationships with, where we had free trade agreements, those tariffs would go from 0 up to 10% or so. But on average, the tariffs are now in the range of, they're about 15%-ish or so on average. And it's actually a moving target. I'll show you how much of a moving target is. The reason why it's a moving target is because after that announcement, they didn't just stand pat with those. They started moving them up and down. So when President Trump announced the higher tariffs against China, China retaliated by imposing higher tariffs on the U.S. And then the U.S. ratcheted up the tariffs on China. China ratcheted up their tariffs, and then they reached an agreement to bring them back down. But it's been sort of this topsy-turvy world for those of us who follow trade policy since last April. And you can sort of see that blue line going up and down depending on whether we're retaliating against another country, whether we're reaching a trade agreement with them and cutting tariffs, whether it's the EU or China or Korea or what have you. And so there's been a lot of volatility. And this is something that's sort of historically unprecedented. Usually we just set these tariffs, we let them rip, we don't touch them, and they go for several years or decades, and then we make some adjustments. The bottom is the effective rate, because there are a lot of exemptions to these tariffs as well. Here's one cartoon that sort of summarizes what the past year has been. Sometimes the tariffs are going up, sometimes they're going down, and it's the EU versus China and this. So the question is, that's sort of what has been in the news for the past year. Why are we doing this? What is the motivation for imposing these higher tariffs? And the administration has basically 4 major objectives that they think we can achieve with these higher tariffs. So first of all, tariffs are taxes, and they raise revenue. And if you haven't paid attention, we are running a huge fiscal deficit. So maybe it's important just to raise revenue for the federal government to help fund our debt and fund our expenditures. Number 2, we have a large merchandise trade deficit. And President Trump in particular is focused on this as a big problem facing the U.S. We want to close that trade deficit. I'll talk about that momentarily. And the question is, will tariffs help us achieve that objective of reducing the trade deficit? Number 3, he would say we've hollowed ourselves out as a nation in terms of manufacturing. We don't employ as many people as we used to in manufacturing, and we need to produce more, and we shouldn't be dependent on other countries, so we want to reshore manufacturing, and the way to get them to do that is to impose tariffs. If you're going to sell in the U.S., you have to produce it in the U.S. That's the goal. Produce in the U.S., bring back jobs, bring back American manufacturing. And in addition, we've been screwed by the rest of the world since the end of World War II, he would say, and therefore we need to get better deals with the rest of the world, and we need leverage to do so, and so tariffs are a way of hitting other countries. If you want to trade with us on equal and fair terms, you have to reach some agreement to rebalance things, and so that we can get a better deal for our exporters and what have you. So what I want to do is just walk through these four explanations for trade policy today and see how they sort of stack up against what most economists, I think, would be some of the evidence. So the first one, in fact, President Trump just the other night reiterated this in his State of the Union message. We should be cutting, in fact, I think he said at the inauguration, his address the other night, but he certainly said here, we can drastically reduce the income tax and just rely on taxes on these imported goods, which other countries pay to fund the federal government. So let's look at that. So here's what the Treasury does. Every month they report on the state of U.S. finances. This is, I believe, for the whole fiscal year 2025, which ended last fall. And you can see on the left-hand side, revenue coming into the federal government. On the right-hand side, you can see expenditures by the federal government. And you can see in the middle there that deficit of about $2 trillion, which is the shortfall of our revenue as opposed to what we're spending. You can see all the things we're spending things on. A little bit worrisome is the fact we're now spending more on net interest than we are on national defense. But we have a lot of entitlement programs. And of course, in terms of the income coming in, income taxes, Social Security taxes, and things of that sort. Well, here's customs duties. And remember, the tariffs weren't in place for much of last year, from the fall. So that is the little sliver of revenue that we are going to grow so we can cut the income tax. That seems a little bit implausible, particularly when we have this huge deficit. So could we possibly fund, get rid of the deficit, let alone cut income taxes, and somehow balance the books? One issue with taxing imports, as opposed to taxing our incomes that we earn as taxpayers, is that imports are very elastic with respect to the price. In other words, the more you tax it, it tends to shrink very quickly. If our income taxes go up, well, we still have to put bread on the table. We're probably still going to work. So labor supply in some sense is inelastic, but imports, much more elastic. So the more we ratchet up those tariffs, it's not clear we're actually going to get revenue because that tax base is going to shrink. Here's another historical way of looking at it, at U.S. revenue sources since 1820. Now, it is true before World War I, the tariff, which is the lower dark line there, funded most of U.S. fiscal spending. Actually, after the Civil War, we had excise taxes and what have you, so only about half were funded by the tariff. But we were only raising about 2% of GDP. Well, our fiscal deficit is more like 6, 7, 8% of GDP. So these tariffs have gone way down. We could ratchet them up. But once again, look at where the revenue is coming. It's from those other sources. It's implausible to believe that we'll be able to raise much more revenue from even much higher tariffs. Put it in perspective. Imports are about 13% of GDP. That's when they weren't taxed very heavily. If we tax them really heavily, that's going to shrink. So we're not going to get 13% of GDP from import tariffs. We're going to get something much less because they'll shrink. So in other words, from a fiscal policy standpoint, it's very unlikely that we're going to raise revenue through taxes on imports in any way that we can really cut the fiscal deficit or fund most government spending by cutting income taxes. In addition, if we tax imports as opposed to incomes, we are substituting a progressive tax for a regressive tax. In other words, the income tax is progressive. The more you earn, the higher your tax will be, whereas an import tariff is levied on the goods that you consume that are produced abroad, and they are disproportionately consumed by middle and lower income households. So there have been a lot of studies, a number of studies showing that the top, say, quintile of the income distribution, or the top 1%, they're not buying stuff at Walmart that's imported from China or other countries. They're buying real estate or stock or what have you. They're not going to be affected as much as a share of their income by these import tariffs, as opposed to lower income households, which are still buying food and clothing and footwear and material goods that tend to be imported. So if we want that as a society, we should go for it, but once again, we're just not going to be able to raise much revenue through these import tariffs. How about reducing the trade deficit? Here's where it seems to sort of, well, first of all, I should clarify, what the president really has in mind is reducing the merchandise trade deficit, because we actually have a trade surplus when it comes to services, and the trade deficit overall considers both goods and services. But the service sector, that's not, us producing things per se, it's producing ideas and software, what have you. He's worried about producing actual physical things. And so he said this is a big problem, so we have these $800 billion deficits because of our very stupid trade policies, and that means that we're importing more than we're exporting, therefore our jobs, we're exporting our wealth when we're buying so much from other countries. The only way this problem can be cured is with tariffs. And so that's one of the goals of the administration. Now here's where it sort of seems to make sense. If our imports are really high and our exports are really low, well, if we impose taxes on imports, we're going to bring those imports down. We're going to shrink imports. And so what's going to happen to the gap? It's going to narrow, right? Unless those tariffs also affect exports, in which case imports will go down and exports go down too, and the gap doesn't change, you just shrunk trade. And here's where you really need to take a course in economics here, because in theory and in practice, tariffs on imports actually redound and have a negative effect on exports. And there are multiple channels by which this can take place. So one is, most manufacturers that export depend on imported components or imported materials. And when you raise the cost of those materials, you raise the cost of those firms that are producing for export, and you make them less price competitive on world markets. In addition, when we impose tariffs on imports, as we saw with China and other countries retaliate. That is, they impose tariffs on our stuff too. And so our exports will go down for that reason. In addition, there can be effects in foreign exchange markets. We've seen the dollar depreciate over much of the last year, but in a very simple sense, imposing tariffs sometimes leads to the appreciation of the dollar, which once again prices out U.S. exports and mitigates some of the impact of that on imports. So there are various reasons why reducing imports just doesn't keep exports at the same level. Exports will go down the same way. It also sort of misses the point that tariffs aren't really driving that trade deficit in the first place. We can't say that other countries have high tariffs, that's why they don't buy from us, whereas we have low tariffs, that's why we're buying so much from them. You can still have balanced trade or imbalanced trade regardless of the state of the tariffs in the two countries. And in fact, it's really capital inflows from abroad that's driving the trade deficit. In other words, for every dollar we put out on foreign exchange markets for imports, they're only using part of that dollar to come back to us in terms of buying our goods and our exports. They're using some of that to buy U.S. assets. They're buying U.S. stock. They're making investments in the U.S. They want the safe haven aspects of the U.S. So if we just look at, on the bottom here, the current account deficit, which is a broad measure of trade deficit as a share of U.S. GDP. And the top, we look at net capital inflows into the United States. They're the mirror image of one another, because the capital flows and the trade flows are interdependent. The implication being, if we want to go to a zero current account of trade balance, we have to somehow stop all this capital from flowing into the United States. But that's not sort of on the agenda, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But what about just the numbers? Isn't it true that President Trump's policies have succeeded in reducing imports and therefore the trade deficit? Well, if you looked at some newspaper reports of earlier this year, when we finally got figures for October, November, and December, this was October, the U.S. trade deficit shrunk to an incredibly low level. And President Trump took some triumph in this, saying, we've cut the trade deficit by an enormous amount. But, of course, what did he sort of miss here? Or what's another part of this picture? What happened right in here, around the time he was inaugurated? Well, it turns out our import deficit, our trade deficit surged. Why? Because everyone knew tariffs were coming, and what do you want to do before the tax comes in? You want to get your goods into the U.S. So there's a surge of imports coming in around the time he was inaugurated in the first few months. Then the trade deficit shrinks. Why? Well, you just front-loaded all those imports. Let's see, here's where he talks about this. He said the trade deficit has been reduced 78%. Well, if you pick those figures right, you pick the big one here, and then the small one there, you can say it's been reduced that. But you have to sort of smooth things out, all these fluctuations. And of course, we've gotten more recent data. and the trade deficit sort of bounced right up back to where it had been. So October was sort of an anomalous month. And when we look at the year overall, the overall trade deficit is larger than it was in 2024. So despite the tariffs, smooth things out, the trade deficit hasn't shrunk as a result. So if we want to reduce the trade deficit, there are other measures that we could do to do that. One would be fiscal policy. That is, not have the U.S. government borrowing so much from other countries, which elevates U.S. interest rates and leads in some sense to those capital inflows. There's a lot of literature on that I can point to later. Okay, what about reshoring jobs and revitalizing American manufacturing? Well, once again, David Brooks, the former New York Times columnist, now works at Atlantic. He said President Trump is the wrong answer to the right question. In some sense, all these things are sort of right. We do need as a nation to raise more revenue. I just don't think tariffs are the way to do it. We maybe want to reduce the trade deficit. But once again, the question becomes what policies can achieve that objective? Tariffs are not it. What about manufacturing? Everyone wants a vital manufacturing sector for the United States, creating jobs, and there is some truth here. Okay? There are a lot of cities, a lot of towns and communities which have been devastated by the closure of plants. And people have been left behind. And the loss of manufacturing jobs, which is a reality. Although most of those jobs have been lost due to technological change, as I'll indicate in a moment, rather than import competition per se. But once again, go to Detroit, go to Gary, Indiana, and it's not going to be a happy picture with respect to the local economy. Once again, technological change has a lot to do with this too. But there's something there that we want to help out manufacturing. Here's what he wrote in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of weeks ago. Saying these tariffs have brought America back. That's why these tariffs are so important. And the White House was tweeting this out, saying the experts were all wrong, saying tariffs wouldn't help to achieve this, bringing America back. What's interesting is the day after this op-ed appeared in the Wall Street Journal, what did the front page of the Wall Street Journal say? So here's where we have to look. So it's one thing to say we oppose tariffs and we brought our America back, but what has happened to factory jobs in the U.S.? What has happened to construction spending in the U.S.? Well, it turns out there was a big boom in surge in total construction spending, but since early 2024 it's been declining. Okay, so we had this big boost up before he took office, before we had the tariffs, and now we're coming off that to some extent. What's happened to job creation since April and the Liberation Day tariffs? This is monthly job creation in the United States. Okay, it looks like it's a little bit slower and weaker, which is why people are not exactly happy with the state of the economy. Well, what about employment in goods-producing industries that have been protected by these tariffs? Well, there's Liberation Day, and this is just the number of manufacturing workers in the United States, and it's actually gone down. And we see that here too. In fact, Wall Street Journal says the U.S. has lost manufacturing jobs every month since Liberation Day. So it's hard to think about this big revitalization of the U.S. economy as a result of these tariffs. And that's just on the employment side. What about on the production side? Manufacturing production is contracting, and it has done so for several months, for much of last year. So it's not as though we're growing the manufacturing size of the economy, and various things about that. So let's dig down just a little bit and think about, actually what he imposed in his first term and reinforced in his second term is imposing tariffs on imported steel. Okay, this is sort of like Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, manufacturing production in Allentown, what have you. And there's this image that, yes, we used to produce a lot of steel, and actually we still do. The way we do it is a little bit different than we did in the past. When we think about all the blue-collar workers, people who just had a high school degree, could leave high school, don't have to worry about college, get a good-paying unionized job in a factory, be able to provide for their family, and have sort of job security for a long time. This is sort of the way we think about the steel industry. As I said, we're still producing a lot of steel, but we just produce it in a different way than this. How do we produce steel today, as opposed to the 1970s? This is how we produce it today. So if you go to a steel factory, so where are the workers? You don't see them. They're running the computers that are, this whole thing is mechanized. That's why I said when it's automation technology that's displaced jobs in manufacturing, not imports. We're still producing steel. It's just we don't have the jobs behind it. In fact, in the 1980s, it took 10 worker hours to produce a ton of steel. 10 worker hours. Today, it takes 1 worker hour to produce a ton of steel because it's all automated. Are they hiring high school graduates? No. They're hiring people who have master's degrees at Carnegie Mellon or the University of Pittsburgh who have a background in metallurgy and computer science, because that's what you need to run the dials of all the machinery that's producing these things. So we're producing steel. It's just we have many fewer workers doing that, and we have a different type of worker, more highly educated worker doing that. So what happens when we put tariffs on imported steel? Well, we only have so much domestic capacity. What happens is that creates scarcity in the market, and the prices go up. Okay, so the tariffs were giving a green light to domestic producers to raise the price of steel. So what do we see? Interestingly, when this first round of tariffs hits in early 2025, the domestic price of steel, which is already well above the foreign or world price of steel, it goes up. Interestingly, we didn't see so much with the second tariff movement, but I'd be curious to see what's going on. That adds to the profitability of domestic steel production. Maybe they'll expand capacity and hire some more workers. But we have to think about when we're imposing high tariffs on steel and the price of steel goes up, well, who's paying that price? I don't know about you or me, but I don't go out to Home Depot on the weekend and buy a bar of steel. I'm not a particularly large steel consumer, but there are steel consumers out there. And this is what Wilbur Ross, who was the previous Commerce Secretary in the Trump administration, first term, said, you know what, no one's going to notice these price increases for steel. So he held up a can of Campbell's soup and said, you know, the amount of steel and aluminum here is like 1 cent. So if that goes up a little bit, no one's really going to notice. So who's going to pay that higher price? Well, as I just said, I don't buy a lot of steel. I presume you don't. Guess who does? Caterpillar. They buy a lot of steel. Who else? John Deere. They buy a lot of steel. Who else? Ford. They buy a lot of steel. So if we raise the domestic price of steel in the United States, that's an input, that's part of the cost that these firms have to pay. Who is John Deere competing against? Who is Caterpillar competing against? Not just in the US, but in third markets. Komatsu, all sorts of Japanese and European producers of very similar farm equipment or heavy earth-moving equipment. So what's happened to John Deere? Well, their costs went up. They can't raise price too much. They'll lose their consumer base or internationally and domestically. So that squeezes their profits. So what does John Deere have to do? Lay off workers. So what happened to all those jobs we're going to create by helping out the steel industry? Yes, maybe we're going to create some more jobs in the steel industry. We're going to lose some in other industries. Ford, $900 million tariff hit. Ford, previously they announced $1.5 billion. Okay, their costs have gone up. That makes them less competitive against foreign imports that come in. GM, $5 billion hit as a result of these tariffs. And it's even redounded to the iron ore industry in Minnesota, where if the auto industry says, whoops, we're going to cut back production because our costs have gone up, that reduces the demand ultimately for iron ore, which is going into the steel industry and what have you. Also aluminum. We've imposed tariffs on aluminum, and what does that do? That creates a separation between the world price and the domestic price of aluminum. Great for aluminum producers in the U.S., very hard and difficult for aluminum consumers in the United States. They have to pay that premium, particularly, once again, if there are other firms. So we've seen what's happened to aluminum prices in the past year. Gone way up, partly as a result of the tariffs and other things. Actually, it turns out it hasn't helped out Alcoa so much, because They also employ workers in Canada, and there's a lot of two-way trade across the Canadian border in aluminum products. And these tariffs have raised their costs, and so they're reducing employment. So once again, employment losses, not employment gains in manufacturing as a result of tariffs. And for the college students here, I don't know what you consume on weekends or maybe during the weekdays, but I can tell you at Dartmouth, at my own institution, beer somehow is very popular, and kegs in particular. And guess what these aluminum tariffs do to the price of kegs? They raise them, and guess what? That's their cost of production. There's one firm in Wisconsin that produces kegs. Their costs went up. They're facing foreign competition from other keg producers overseas, and so there have been layoffs at that Wisconsin plant that produces kegs. So we're hurting the keg industry with these aluminum tariffs. I was recently down in North Carolina. North Carolina is a state that has been hammered as a result of foreign competition in the past, in particular with respect to the furniture industry and a little bit with the textile industry. They lost a lot of jobs in the 2000s in the furniture industry. And it's for that reason that President Trump says, okay, we are going to impose tariffs on furniture. And this is what he said with respect to North Carolina. We want to make North Carolina great again. They've lost the furniture industry to China, and so we're going to impose these higher tariffs. So, is the furniture industry jumping up and down with this? And there was a Financial Times article exactly on the North Carolina furniture industry, and it turns out they had already adjusted to the foreign competition. They had moved upscale, up quality ladder, and so we import the cheaper stuff, which actually has been hit previously with tariffs, and so we get a lot of it from Vietnam. But the last one here just says, but analysts said the retreat also reflects intense industry lobbying and domestic political pressure over prices and realization that implications of tariffs as a tool to bring back manufacturing in the U.S. What sort of industry? Interesting is the furniture industry doesn't want these tariffs. It's interrupting their supply chains and raising their costs, and so they don't want this. In fact, it says right here, here's a wholesaler who says it just doesn't work that way. It's a nice talking point, but for the people who believe in tariffs, but it doesn't exactly work that way. There's sort of this analogy like if you accidentally run over someone's foot with your car, you say, my gosh, I'm sorry for all that damage. Let me put the car in reverse and go back and undo the damage. Well, we sort of lost those jobs 20 years ago. And imposing tariffs now isn't exactly going to undo that, and the furniture industry is an example of that. And then we think, oh, well, aren't we going to, we're trying to help out job creation by imposing these tariffs. Well, who lost jobs? We've lost jobs in the furniture industry. Maybe some of them will come back. But North Carolina's also lost about 8,000 jobs just in one industry, the hog industry, because other countries have retaliated against U.S. furniture tariffs by imposing tariffs on our imported pork, and so the pork farmers have to face a lower price for that. This all comes back to what's the price impact of these things? Okay, so President Trump has said, we don't pay these tariffs. These are taxes on imported goods. It's the foreign countries pay these taxes. Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, was asked, aren't these taxes on consumers in the U.S.? And he said, no, tariffs help consumers. I do not believe tariffs are a tax on consumers. Well, this sort of raises the question, so who is actually paying these tariffs? Can we shift the burden on other countries, or is it being borne domestically? Well, as Warren Buffett says, someone's got to pay the tariffs. It's not the tooth fairy, so who's paying it? Well, here's an experiment. Early last year, President Trump signed an executive order putting a 25% tariff on imported automobiles. What do we think that does to the price in the United States of automobiles? Well, once again, if we're importing less, that creates scarcity in the market and the price goes up. And it's not just the price of new cars and imported cars, it's the price of domestic substitutes, including used cars. Now, if you try to buy a used car, those prices have gone up too, because people can't afford to buy the new ones, there's demand shifts over to those. And there's some estimates that car prices could go up by about $4,000 as a result of these higher tariffs. Now, President Trump warned the automakers, don't raise your prices. Well, first of all, if the tax was being paid on foreign countries, we wouldn't have to worry about that. But then he later said, well, actually, it doesn't matter. Raise your prices if you want to. So he sort of had it both ways in terms of which way the prices go. But we know because we have the data, we can just observe what happens to domestic prices when we impose tariffs. And so this is some data from the first term, when we had tariffs on Chinese goods and tariffs on steel and aluminum. And lo and behold, when those tariffs took effect, the prices of those tariffed goods went up. We can see that in particular cases too, just shrimp. Okay, we impose a tariff, what happens? Domestic prices go up. Amazon, what do they say? Well, they actually want to include a line in your little checkout saying, oh, we have to tack this amount on because of a tariff. And the administration said, you can't do that. We don't want you to expose what the tariff's doing to prices. But that's what happened. If you happen to buy something from another country and DHL is bringing it in, DHL will tell you, guess what? We're not paying that tariff when it comes in. We're going to pass that on to you. And sometimes it can be a rather large amount, which has surprised consumers when you're buying something and having it shipped in. A lot of stories about small businesses dependent on foreign-produced goods for their inputs and what they sell, and that they get tacked on. This affected me personally, directly, in January and February of last year, when President Trump said we're imposing a 25% tariff on goods coming from Canada and Mexico. I live in New England, which is very close to the Canadian border. Turns out we get a lot of our propane from Irwin Energy, and their refinery is in New Brunswick, and it comes across the border. Irwin Energy, I have a contract with Irwin Energy. We pre-buy a certain amount of propane at a fixed price. We got this message, and I guess this is dated February of last year, saying, oh, if you have these fixed contracts, the tariff cost will be added to your fixed price for the remainder, because once again, we can't pay this price. We're passing it on to you. I'm very fortunate. I'm a professor at Dartmouth. I can afford that price, but guess what? There are many people in neighboring communities who are balancing their budget week by week, and they can't necessarily afford to pay this extra price for propane to heat their house, and they have to make very difficult choices about how much food they're going to have or whether they can possibly afford a vacation as opposed to paying to heat their house in the very cold New England winters. That gets to the regressive aspect of tariffs as well. Now, inflation has picked up a lot, and so J.D. Vance, the Vice President, said it's almost like the economic profession doesn't fully understand tariffs because we expect the price to go up. It doesn't quite work that way because the share of traded goods in the consumer price index is pretty small. So even if we levy really high tariffs, you're not going to notice it, and the tariffs take a little time to take effect. You're not going to notice it in 1 month. CPI is a big bump. But here's where the administration sort of suggests, actually, they do know these impacts, because what they have done is after announcing these sweeping tariffs, they've announced all sorts of exemptions on the grounds of price relief. Well, that's sort of funny. If foreign countries are paying for the tariffs in the first place, why do we need to cut the tariffs to provide price relief? What did they do here? Coffee, bananas, beef. Why were they afraid of the coffee tariff? Well, we see that price, most of us, every single day. We see the banana price. And what's different with coffee and bananas? We're not going to jumpstart domestic production. We're not going to start, bringing the labor force here to produce bananas and coffee. So we're not going to create any jobs. What's the point of those taxes? And in fact, they later exempted smartphones from China, laptop computers from China, all sorts of things where we would see directly those price impacts. And this has led to a lot of chaos because then there's a lot of fighting over who gets a tariff exemption and who doesn't. And this is why trade policy has been very difficult to follow for the past year, because on Tuesday, you have the trade representative of the United States saying before Congress, we're making no exceptions. We're imposing these things, and the president's going to follow through. And then on Saturday, they announce all sorts of exemptions. And that's why the tariffs are sort of going up and down, and because it's just sort of this chaotic thing. Well, if you're providing a lot of exemptions, who gets the exemptions? Did we all write letters to members of Congress saying we want cheaper coffee? Not really. We don't get that activated. It's business interests that have influence in Washington. And so what's happened is lobbying over tariffs done by K Street lawyers in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere has just skyrocketed. All sorts of firms are now paying for law firms in Washington to lobby for either exemptions or higher tariffs or this or that. It's becoming political football that's been going on. At any rate, that just ends my third point about, are we creating a lot of jobs here? Well, actually, we are. We're not creating this one. We're creating jobs for lawyers, trying to understand what the situation is. But we might have some more jobs in basic steel and basic aluminum, but we're losing jobs in all the industries that rely on that for their inputs, and we're losing jobs in export industries that get hit by retaliation. So what about all these trade deals? And the president has announced quite a number of trade deals. Are we getting reciprocity now? Are we getting fair trade? Let's look at one of the agreements that we got with the United Kingdom not too long ago. And they're very partial, odd sort of deals from the standpoint of what agreements we had in the past. They cover a few products, a few little tariffs here and there, but here's sort of the operative language. This is not a legally binding agreement. So this is sort of a handshake deal between the Prime Minister and the President. Nothing's really hammered out, and it's not clear how long lasting it will be. And it may not last even beyond what the Supreme Court has just done in terms of validating some tariffs, which I'll get to. But what's once again missing from some of these deals, which are really very thin, is the fact that U.S. exporters, particularly in the farm sector, have lost ground against foreign competitors because countries, yeah, they'll come when we strong-arm them to cut these deals, but they really resent what the U.S. is doing. And they start buying from other countries. So, look on the right hand here, which is soybeans. There's U.S. exports trudging along, which are flat, and guess who's really benefited from the trade war? Brazil. Because now China and other Asian countries are saying we'd rather buy our soybeans from Brazil than from the United States, because the United States hasn't treated us very fairly. And the same true on the left-hand side there with corn. And once again, it's Brazil is now matching the U.S. in terms of exports of corn, where we used to really dominate those markets. So what's the sort of problem with tariffs in some sense? So what I'm just leaving you with there is these deals don't really amount to much. They're not really opening up foreign countries to our markets. In fact, they might even make the trade deficit worse, because one of the provisions is we want more foreign investment in the U.S. And if we go back to what I was talking about, the trade deficit, if we have more capital inflows in the U.S., that means a larger trade deficit. Complicated point. But the problem with tariffs, as economists sort of see it, is they don't really achieve the objective. Like all those objectives we could want. We need more revenue, we want more manufacturing jobs, maybe we want a lower trade deficit, we want better deals. Are tariffs the way to achieve those objectives? And we can see they've been counterproductive. They're paid for by the U.S., not by other countries, and they lead to retaliation against the U.S., which, once again, is not very helpful. So let's go to J.P. Morgan, see what their advice is from one of their chief strategists, and this is what he says. The trouble with tariffs is that they raise prices, slow economic growth, cut profits, increase unemployment, worsen inequality, diminish productivity, and increase global tensions. Other than that, they're fine. And that sort of summarizes that it's not really working out the way the president's suggesting, and the American people sort of get that in a way. Once again, I said at the beginning, only 45% of Americans really understand what tariffs are. But if you do people approve these tariffs, it doesn't look very good. 2/3 against. And once again, look at another poll. What's the president approval on various key issues? Tariffs, once again, sort of not very favorable. Much more favorable on immigration, and even a little bit less with the economy, but not so much on tariffs. So that raises the question, if they're unpopular and they're not going to achieve the objective, why are we doing it? And I think we have to go back to one person. One person deeply believes. In fact, there's not a political consensus in Washington between Republicans and Democrats that this is the right thing to do. This is really one person who cares deeply about this issue. Why does this person care so much? What is motivating that? If we go to an early Bob Woodward book from the first term, he has this remarkable page where he has in the president's own writing what he wrote on Air Force One, trade is bad. And if you think that, and if you think that America is stronger by shrinking trade, then tariffs make sense. If you think trade is bad. And this is what he said. By not trading, we're losing nothing. In fact, we're saving $1 trillion. That's a lot. Because the way he views it is when we import something from the rest of the world, we're paying them money, and it's sort of a loss. It doesn't sort of count the fact, actually they're selling us something that we value and find useful. And that trade is a two-way process where we can both benefit. When I go to my local grocery store and buy something, I don't leave there grumbling over the fact they just took my money. I got something in return that I didn't have to buy from them. I could buy from others, but it's very difficult for me to produce those things myself. But that's not a loss in some sense. It's not a loss to me by doing that. But he views imports as lost money because we're spending something on it. And that's why he doesn't like the trade deficit, because he views that as a loss. So here he says, he's asked about the port traffic in Los Angeles and Long Beach and Newark is going down. He said that's a good thing. That means we're losing less money. And once again, if that's your view of things, that's where sort of the tariffs are coming from. And it's not just that trade is bad, it's that the view that globalization has failed us. That's the narrative. And this is Secretary of Commerce Letnick saying, what does it say? Globalization has failed, and therefore we're pulling back from globalization. And what does he say here? Well, here's the counterpoint. Yes, we saw in North Carolina that the furniture industry didn't do well 20 years ago, and that certain parts of Detroit and Michigan and the upper Midwest have not done well. But we are still a preeminent economic power. And we've done very well over the past 30 years or 40 years in this era of globalization. Scott Lincecum, who's at the Cato Institute, points this out. Since 1990 or so, it started this sort of globalization era, if you want to call that, real wages up, real GDP up, infant mortality down, total mortality down, industrial capacity up. This has not been a terrible couple of decades for the U.S. economy. But when you sort of point this out or try to push back, here's what Robert Lighthizer, once again under President Trump's first term, his trade representative said, economists have been wrong about everything. Why should we listen to economists? And so maybe we should just believe tariffs are making our country strong and rich. But as I tried to sort of lay out, there's there's another view that one can take. That these haven't worked out so well, and it's not working out so well for the U.S. economy, not revitalizing manufacturing, and will create a lot of problems with the farm sector and what have you. So before I conclude, let me just mention what's happened over this past week, where the Supreme Court just invalidated a lot of President Trump's tariffs. Not all of them, but certain ones under a law known as IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, 1977. And here's what the court ruled. You can download their decision. IEEPA does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. And then you can read the other 150 pages on justifying that. It's just reading the law and saying the president does not have authority, legal authority under that law delegated from Congress, because Congress, under the Constitution, has the authority to levy tariffs. That law does not authorize the president to do these things. Now, and that's, the American people, quick polls sort of agree with that, but actually it's a very tricky legal issue. But here's the point. The tariffs aren't going to go away. We don't have the judges coming in saying what policy ought to be. They're saying that law does not justify what you did. But there are a whole bunch of other statutes on the books that allow the president to impose tariffs, and now these are going to be brought out. And so one of them is Section 232, which allows import tariffs in the case of national security. That's how we protected the steel industry with recent tariffs. There's Section 301, which deals with unfair trade practices. So this is not going to change administration policy very much. It's going to make the legal justification of those tariffs different than it has been in the past. It will constrain the president a little bit because each of these laws requires much more constrained delegation to the president. Only under certain circumstances can you impose these tariffs, whereas IEEPA has its very broad view. And that's why the president could say, after a phone call, say, with the president of Switzerland, that phone call didn't go very well, so the tariff's going to go up to 39%. And that's why Brazil, when you're going to imprison a former president who was a buddy of mine, your tariff's going to go up to 60%. There's no other law that would justify sort of that random movement in tariffs. And so that sort of midnight tweeting on tariffs will probably go away, but we're still going to be having these tariffs just under different statutory authority. Thank you very much. I'd love to hear any questions or comments.
The thing we should do is have you call people, because
Okay.
and I'll just write
Would
them, Jim, you can say. Does anybody like to ask a question?
Question over there? Got more over here.
Okay. I've got kind of a loud voice. I probably don't need the mic.
Okay.
I was just going to say, can you give us an example of a potential useful application of a tariff? So it's something that exists. Clearly, it's not achieving the objectives that they were laid out to achieve, which you've shown very irrefutable evidence of that. What's a useful application of a tariff, potentially?
One thing, so I had those 4 reasons. What would be a 5th reason they didn't talk about?
To make some people really rich?
Corruption, something like that. Let's throw that one out. Yep, look at that. Yeah. National security. So that's actually one of those statutes. And Adam Smith, the great Scottish economist, has a statement in the Wealth of Nations: defense is more important than opulence. So there may be certain products and countries, i.e. China, from which we do not want to be dependent. So, for example, what we've learned from Ukraine is that drones are incredibly important for the future of warfare. Do we want to be in a country as a situation where we are dependent on China for the little cameras on drones, for the batteries in drones, for the manufacture of drones? That's a value judgment? I would say not. That we should have that domestic capability, or with our allies have that capability.
Are there historical examples of that being implemented effectively?
I can't think of any, because, in fact, right before World War I, this was a concern of the British government. The British government sponsored a report around 1912 or so saying, what products are we really dependent on Germany in case there's a war or something like that? And they came up with a list. They didn't do anything about it, but it didn't really matter, because it turns out when war happened, you can't predict what you'll need. And so, for example, we in the United States have a stockpile of mohair goats. Mohair goat. Because during the Korean War, and this gets to your point about making certain people rich, during the Korean War, our soldiers were fighting in a very cold climate. Turns out mohair, the goats of mohair goats, has good insulation properties. We started subsidizing them. Bill Clinton tried to get rid of the mohair goat subsidy. We're fighting more in the Middle East now, and we don't exactly need,
It never goes away.
It didn't go away. Actually, it went away for 1 year, and then it came right back. Because where they produced, or where mohair goats sort of roaming, Montana. 2 senators, one could be on the Agricultural Committee or the Budget Committee, they'll just strike that out of any law. And so, yes, all these things are in principle. In principle, there's a national security reason for being independent for certain things. But the question is, maybe not mohair goats, but then it's politics about where you make that cut.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It says here that you worked alongside Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. I was wondering, in the past 30 or 47 years, which administration or presidency really nailed the tariff question, or succeeded in that sort of formulation in that aspect?
Well, first of all, I was a very, very young man at the time. I was still in graduate school. I didn't work with him, so I worked on the staff at the council. So I have the Oval Office handshake and all that sort of thing. And I'm very proud of that service. I had an op-ed in the New York Times when was it? Remember when Ontario had an ad during the World Series? They actually quoted from Reagan's speeches on tariffs, which is very counter to what the Trump administration is doing. President Trump got very upset and threatened tariffs on Canada for that ad during the World Series. But I wrote an op-ed. If you Google my name in the New York Times or whatever, you can find it. And I sort of outlined what was Reagan's policy, why did it differ from Trump. And Reagan was not a doctrinaire free trader. There's a lot of protectionism in the U.S. that he oversaw in the early 1980s. So it's a very nuanced case, partly because in the early 1980s, because we had a big recession, it was a very difficult period for manufacturing. But he also wanted more open markets, and he was able to balance those two things in a very interesting way. So, Wall Street Journal once quipped about anti-dumping duties, which are a very specific type of tariff. The best way to think about anti-dumping is not to think about it. I think the best way to think about tariffs is not to think about it, in the sense that it used to be a third-order issue for politics. Yeah, you'd have to bring it out every now and then to help out some certain politically powerful industry, but you don't want to be fiddling with them every month. And you don't want to be in the headlines every month. You want to sort of set the dials, set the tariffs where you want. Like we had a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. It was renegotiated by President Trump. But he didn't like that renegotiation. That's why he came out of the box. It just creates so much volatility and uncertainty for businesses. Let's set the rates and forget about it and let the economy go and focus on really important matters, not whether the tariff should go to 15 to 20% and then back down. It's just too much.
Do you foresee a reevaluation in particularly the Republican Party away from the more classical liberal view of economics and more towards the really classical Trumpian view of kind of mercantilist economics?
That's a great question because, as I sort of suggested to you, all these tariffs don't reflect some societal consensus, some Washington, D.C. consensus, some congressional consensus that we want to have this volatility and these higher tariff rates. It's really coming from one person. And so the question is, where is Congress in all this? Congress has a constitutional authority over trade policy ultimately. The Republican Party traditionally under Reagan, what have you, traditionally was much more in favor of freer trade and open markets, and that seems to have gone by the wayside with President Trump. Mitt Romney, previous administrations prior to Trump, were very much in the Reagan-esque stance. And a lot of Republicans represent farm states in the Midwest, which have always wanted, market access for exports. And so they're very upset with these trade wars. Republicans have been largely silent in Congress, but there was a recent vote, and I can't remember exactly what the issue was, where about reconsidering some of the tariffs, and about 4 Republicans broke in the House and voted to, I can't remember the particular issue, broke with the party and sort of suggested we ought to rethink our tariff policy. So I don't think the Republican Party is going to swing back to the way it had been, because I think sort of the populist, economic, nationalist element is much larger now with President Trump. But I do think in a post-Trump era, there's going to have to be a rethink among Republicans about what exactly our position is on trade policy. There's also been a bit of a reckoning for Democrats too, because there was something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which you might have heard of, that President Obama endorsed, Republicans endorsed, Democrats were very much against in the late Obama administration. And if you remember the Democratic National Convention in 2016, when Hillary Clinton was getting the nomination, there was a sea of no TPP placards and signs in the Democratic Convention. And Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they hate trade agreements on very much Trumpian grounds. It helps multinationals, it doesn't hurt, it hurts the working people, trade has been bad for us. So Democrats are not exactly a pro-trade party. And if Republicans have also become not a pro-trade but an anti-trade party too, it's usually, history shows, there's one pro-trade party and one anti-trade party. They sort of differ on that. So it's very unusual to have both anti-trade. And so, but now, with Trump embracing tariffs so much, Democrats are sort of coming around and saying, gee, part of the affordability agenda, we want lower tariffs. Part of re-engaging with our allies, we want lower tariffs. So we're in a very odd point in American politics with respect to the trade issue in the parties. The parties are both sort of different and changing their views.
So kind of going on to that point, I've heard a lot of Democratic politicians make a similar point that you did, that tariffs are a tax on U.S. corporations, the instance of which is largely borne by consumers, which I'm very sympathetic to. Do you think they're going to remember those arguments the next time somebody brings up increasing corporate income taxes?
You know, I don't know. So, you know, part of this is like what plays and what that's why the import tariffs have the superficial appeal. We're taxing the imports. We're taxing the other countries. It's not us. Even though we see the burden being borne domestically.
But it seems like this argument that the U.S. consumer faces the taxes,
right?
Like, you know, if it's passed through to consumers when it's a tariff, it should also pass through to consumers when it's when it's a corporate income tax or it's some other sort of cost borne by U.S. businesses, and yet that argument never comes up.
So taxes, incidence is always sort of a fun area. So we think, oh, we're taxing corporations. Corporations are paying the tax. But no, you're right, they're passing it on. So the analogy would be this. Most cities and towns in the United States have dog taxes. Do dogs pay the tax? No, the owners of the dogs pay the tax. Who's paying the corporate tax? Well, the owners of the corporation, not the corporation per se, which means shareholders. Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little more about the post-Trump era. So he sticks with these tariffs until the end of his term. What happens after is to solve the problem, just get rid of the tariffs and then the graphs start going up? Or what's the residue left in the industries that have been affected by those tariffs?
Here's the problem. What can go up quickly often comes down slowly, if at all. So just because the tariffs can go up really fast, really quick, doesn't mean they can be easily reversed for a number of reasons. First of all, if a new administration comes in and says, we reject that previous trade policy, there's going to be some problems with just getting rid of it. First of all, the revenue effects. So I sort of said it's not a big deal, the total amount of revenue, given the size of the federal government and what have you. But guess what? We do have a major fiscal deficit. And for the government or administration to say we're just getting rid of this tax overnight, sacrificing that amount of income, the question becomes, well, how are you going to make that up in terms of the deficit elsewhere? So it's going to be very difficult to get rid of those taxes for that reason. Another reason, we've raised these taxes. Businesses right now don't like them, but guess what? They're adjusting to them. And so you're going to get some firms going to say, okay, we're going to start producing more steel. We'll throw out an extra shift because of that, even though other firms are paying the price of that. And then, oh, now we're going to get rid of that tariff, and so we're going to have to lose that shift and lay off those workers. That's going to be not politically popular. Politically, too, if you say, oh, we raised the tariffs and now we're going to just get rid of them, but we're not going to negotiate with other countries. We have this leverage and we're just going to give it up. When we could try to negotiate in good faith with other countries and say, we'll reduce our tariff if you do something for us too. So you're going to have to negotiate to get those tariffs down. So President Trump can raise those tariffs overnight, but they're not going to come down quickly. So the post-Trump agenda will be, what sort of strategy, what sort of vision do you have for those tariffs to sort of either scale them back, reach agreements with other countries, make the adjustments. So what did President Biden do in his term? He could have reversed some of those tariffs. He didn't reduce a one. So in the first term, President Trump imposed tariffs on steel. Biden didn't want to get rid of those because the steel industry and the steel workers liked it. And we imposed tariffs on China. And sort of for national security, he wasn't going to unilaterally get rid of those tariffs on China unless he reached some deal, and there wasn't much discussion about that. So there's a ratchet effect with tariffs. It's really hard to get them back down again. So I suspect it won't be status quo. It'll be a very different policy, but it's not going to change the tariff rates or levels very much.
Hi. So you mentioned tariff is a tool of national security. So when the U.S. imposes a tariff on another country, so in usual sense, which country's economy suffers more, the U.S. or the other country? And when it comes to tariff war, do you think the U.S. economy can outlast its opponents, such as China or Russia?
So in the first one, who's hurt more when we impose these tariffs? Obviously, it depends on the country, but let's take a very important example. Canada. Do we depend more on Canada, or does Canada depend more on us?
Depend more on us.
Canada depends more on us. So when we impose these tariffs on Canada, or the threat, or what have you, we're not going to notice that much. But for Canada, it's a huge deal. It's a really big deal. And that's why they're actually, I talked about retaliation, there's been boycotts of US goods, and a lot of anti-American sentiment, and a lot of tourists did not come last summer and fall to the United States from Canada, they went elsewhere. So the impact, so there's an old phrase that if the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. So when we impose these tariffs, it's not going to make, it's going to have some impact on us, but a big impact on our close partners. Now once again, it depends on the country. China's in a much, it sells a lot to the US, but it's a small share of their GDP. They'll do all right. Vietnam sells more, so they're going to be affected. It sort of depends on the country, how much effect there are. But then you raise this question, who wins in some sense? In some sense, neither country wins, unless there's some other objective that you're trying to achieve. So if we want domestic drone production, we'll win in the sense that we'll bring back, we'll have establish some production here, but it might be more costly, it will take some time, but I don't think winning and losing is the right way to think about it. Economists usually think about trade as a mutually beneficial exchange. So Canada sells us propane to us in New England, and we export other things to Canada to pay for those. And so they're winning, we're winning. It's a mutually advantageous arrangement. Oh, I guess the microphone's gone.
Hi. So from the survey, we can see that not a lot of people are very familiar with tariffs, and I'm not really either. So I was really curious, apart from negotiation, is there a math to how much they propose to set tariffs on? Or is it just purely negotiating, lobbying?
Can you give me 1 second? I'll show you the formula, if I can find it. Let's see. One second. So the basic answer to your question is, so the president wanted tariffs, he wanted them to differ by country, and he wanted it somehow related to the trade deficit. So this is the actual formula used to sort of generate those tariffs, which amount to the trade deficit over imports. And this is sort of the way I've sort of summarized it. When you question each and every stage of these tariffs, let me just point out that, once again, the econ majors here will understand the math a little bit. This 4 times 1/4, so that's the elasticity of imports, import demand. That's what that is there. And that is the pass-through elasticity. What percent of the tariff passes through to final consumers? 4. That's what they picked. That's a good number. We economists run these regressions all the time. 4 is a reasonable number. 1/4. That's saying for a 100% tariff, the domestic price will only go up 25%. That's really wrong. All the evidence is, guess what that 1/4 should be? 1. Basically, full pass-through. So these cancel out. If this was 1, guess what? You have a 4 in the denominator. What happens to all the tariffs? They're cut by 1/4. So in other words, by picking that number there, they inflated the tariffs by sort of a factor of 4 or something like that. So that's why those tariffs were 40, 50, 60% or so. If you'd sort of stuck with the formula, which one could question itself, but plugged in the right number, you would have had something like 10, 12% or something like that, much lower. So the answer to the question is, there was a formula. It wasn't just based on lobbying. Now, all the exemptions, that's lobbying. Or that's domestic political pressure. Like members of Congress saying, I'm getting a lot of emails and calls about coffee prices. Help us out. Because I'm running for re-election. So they said, okay, coffee goes on the duty-free list. So it's not completely arbitrary. Now, all the tariff threats are arbitrary. So, as I mentioned, Switzerland. I think the Swiss tariff that came out of this was about 30%. He had a phone call where the Swiss president was, they didn't get along. So he said 39%. That's just pure arbitrary, what's going on, stuff like that. I should say, sometimes when the president makes these threats, just because the president says it, there has to be an executive order issued. So after that Ontario ad from Canada about Reagan, he said 10% more tariff on Canadian goods. Well, they never did the executive order. So he just said that to get it off his chest. It didn't happen. So that's one of the things that we trade economists are watching is we can't look at the announcements. We have to go to the Federal Register and look for the actual notice. Are they going to enforce that tariff or not? Yes.
The dumbest thing about this isn't even the 414 thing. It's that they applied it to bilateral deficits.
Right.
Every individual country is absolutely absurd. It's like saying I can't get a haircut because like I would be running a deficit with my barber, even though I get money from, it's just it's crazy.
Well, here's the other thing too, is that we run a trade surplus with a bunch of countries too. And so we should have negative tariffs on them. Or if this logic of trade deficits and surpluses, it means you're getting screwed or screwing someone else, we're screwing a lot of other countries because we have a trade surplus with them. Of course, that's not true, but yes.
How do you think a value-added tax could achieve some of these objectives without a tariff?
Economists get very excited when you start talking about value-added taxes because it's a consumption tax. Actually, what's even better about it is there's a border adjustment to these value-added taxes. So actually, we need to impose a tariff to equalize the tax treatment of foreign goods in the domestic market. So during the first term, a lot of trade tax economists got excited saying, if the president really wants tariffs, actually we can do that in conjunction with the VAT, and it makes perfect economic sense. But then what the president and advisors say, well, we want the tax on the foreign countries, but we don't want the domestic tax. But you sort of need both of them to make it sort of a level playing field.
Do we need to follow where the microphone is? We have time for
Okay.
one more question.
Yep.
Okay, looking ahead about 10 years down the line, if we don't change anything, if the tariffs stay, what will the world look like? How does U.S. look like? And what's the impact on the rest of the world and the business?
Good job.
I think what's less important than the level of the tariffs per se is the volatility of the tariffs and the use of tariffs as a threat against other countries. And so here's where our relationship with Canada is really important. Because we've had a peaceful border for centuries. They have been an ally and a fighter of wars with us for decades. And we have severely jeopardized that relationship. And it's not going to be forgotten. It has long-run consequences. So if you look at what Prime Minister Mark Carney said at Davos a couple of weeks ago, where he said, if the laws don't protect you, the law of trade, you got to protect yourself. And so they're pulling back from the U.S. So they are worried about an American invasion, as crazy as that sounds. They are starting on a remilitarization zone where they're saying, we're going to buy domestic goods. We cannot source from the U.S. because they could cut us off. If we buy fighter jets from the U.S. and there's some sort of issue, they may cut off the spare parts. So we're going to buy European, and that's why they've reached out to China. They're trying to solidify their links with the EU. So I think what's much more important is we treat our friends as friends. Even if we don't reduce the tariff so much, stability will matter. They've invested billions of dollars building a bridge between Ontario and Michigan, which we wanted and supported, and all of a sudden President Trump says, we may not allow that bridge to open. That's astounding. That's astounding. And so the damage in terms of our foreign relationships, actually, we need Canada for Arctic security. Canada's interests are not different from ours. Yet to alienate your roommate, you have to live with for no real good reason. If there was true friction or true problem in the relationship, obviously we should deal with that. But we're worried about Canadian dairy subsidies, and that's sort of it. We can't identify what the problem is, what we want them to do. It's astounding. Denmark and Greenland. We could have as many military bases as we want. Do we have to take it over? Once again, we're jeopardizing a relationship. That's the cost of the policy going forward. It hurts our national security. So the tariffs hurt the economy. But compared to maintaining a relationship, good relationship with allies and friends, that's so much more important. And that's why the trade issue can't just be viewed through the lens of economics. The economics are important. I don't think it's helping the U.S. economy. But once again, we're a very big economy. We're a very diversified economy. We're largely a service economy. So we're messing up agriculture and manufacturing to some extent at the margin. But once again, we could repair that harm with new investment and lower tariffs. But it's very hard to repair relationships that have been built up over decades, and then you lose very quickly. So that's the true cost, I think, of these policies.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.